When the royal guard invaded the forest for the first time, the trees screamed. My mother knew exactly what that meant and wasted no time grabbing me and my brother Ren. As we ran through the trees, I saw everyone I'd ever known running with us. Then, a popping noise, louder than the forest had heard in my lifetime. Cries of anguish echoed every which way. It continued, and finally I saw the effect. It was a magic unlike any I'd experienced. About 10 feet in front of me, a woman collapsed. I screamed and cried, and my mother didn't even stop. She stepped on a woman's body as she pulled us along. Her blood pooled around her, her face stuck in a moment of terror. I tell myself every day that there was nothing I could have done. We kept running, and when we made it to the river, we were finally allowed to stop. I thought that it was over, at least for a while. I was still under the impression that at some point I get to return to my home. My mother knelt to look us in the eyes. She seemed like she was going to say something, but she couldn't decide what. Never before had I seen her so worried, not even when Dad left, not even when Ren got sick. Another loud bang sounded, so loud they must have been right next to me. Why couldn't I see them? The trees were thick, and there were so many creatures running through them. Where were the soldiers? Where had the noise come from? My searching had distracted me, but I finally looked back right in front of me. Ren, I said, as if he hadn't seen it, as if he wasn't now cradling Mom's head in his hands, as if her blood hadn't sprayed and covered us both. Ren, I say again, this time losing my composure.
We have to keep going.
No, we can't just leave her.
Elana, run.
My brother had never been so serious, so I did what any child would do. I ran.
Her eyes seemed to take up most of her face. They were so prominent that it actually took me a few moments to process the blood. I wanted to clean it off, to tell her it would be okay, but it wouldn't be. This wasn't the first place they'd invaded, and hers wasn't the first family to be slaughtered in their quest to rid the world of magic. Somehow, that didn't make it any easier. "What's your name?" I asked her because I guess I like the pain of knowing.
Elana.
"I'm Senecal. I know a place we can go," I told her, even though I wasn't sure that I did. Magic's birthplace was somewhat of a myth, but it was also our only chance. I'd thought about trying before, about following my first love, but I'd found somewhere safe, and that wasn't something easily left. Most people weren't too fond of fire spirits, being that most people have a natural fear of being set on fire. But if this little girl had found me, the soldiers would too. They wouldn't be far behind, and we had to keep moving. How long would we have to run? How long would I keep running? A gunshot sounded in the distance, and I flinched. Even after all I'd seen, I flinched. It was time to move. Willow's words from 40 years before rang in my ears as if she was still standing beside me.
"You'll want to follow me someday, and my voice will guide you."
Her voice, sent with the wind all the way to me. Wind spirits really were something else. I began to climb up the mountain, Elana following behind me.
I ran until I got to the base of the mountain, and that's when I noticed that Ren wasn't with me anymore. His name swelled inside me and almost made it out of my throat before I realized that yelling was not a good idea. Frantically, I searched the area around me for any sign of life. Nothing. This was it. I was going to die in the woods just like my mother. Only this time it would be my fault, and I would be alone. Then a monster appeared. No, a fire spirit. Mom had told me about them, but there weren't any in our village. It was a being of pure fire. There was somehow a face and sort of a vague body, but it seemed like it was just a person caught in the state of burning to death. I wondered if this thing felt pain. She asked me for my name, and I told her. She was terrifying, and might accidentally kill me if I got too close. But she was my only hope, so I followed her.
The higher we got, the quieter the world around us was. It started to feel safe. Each step was one step further from the soldiers, one step closer to Willow. Willow. 40 years I'd spent forgetting her, trying to move on with my life, failing miserably to find happiness with anyone else.
Duck into this cave. It's a shortcut.
Willow's voice rang out. Without hesitation, I went in. Elana did not share my same confidence. "It's all right," I told her. This didn't seem to help.
Senecal waved me forward, her flames licking at the sides of the cave. I shook my head. If I went in there, I was sure to catch fire. But then my mother's body came into my mind. The face of the terrified woman we walked over. If I stayed out here, they would catch me. Why did they want to catch me? Why is this happening? I asked. She didn't have an answer. I followed her into the cave, keeping as much distance as I dared without falling into the darkness.
My flames illuminated the blood on her face in such a way that she seemed more creature than child. I tried not to look at her. Focusing ahead, I marched my way through the blackness, lighting the way as I went. It was a long path, and it was very steep most of the time. It took us hours to get through.
It had surely been days by the time we emerged into the sunlight. My tears had dried up, my stomach was wailing for food, and I thought I might fall over from exhaustion. "Is this the safe place?" I asked.
I think it is. The cave had let us out into a beautiful town square. Quaint wooden buildings, cobblestone streets, and carts of goods were all surrounded by people. And not just people. Spirits, fairies, elves, all manner of creatures. If this wasn't the birthplace of magic, then I couldn't imagine how magical that place would be. In this place, I felt safe. That was new.
How was it possible that everything here was brighter? The trees were the same as those I'd grown up with, yet somehow more. Everything in this place was more.
When I woke up, I was in some kind of cabin. Pine cones and various different artistic sculptures and paintings surrounded me. The last thing I remembered, I was running after my little sister in a blind panic. Elana! Where was she? Had she been taken with me? My cabin was full of other people who had been fleeing. Groups huddled, wounded lay out on cots, and nurses flitted about the room. Elana! I called, but there was no answer. Barely anyone even looked my way. I called her name again and again as I pushed my way to the door. I exploded out onto a path. It wound through the woods, and I saw many other cabins along it. How long would it take before I found her? Was she even here?
She's here.
A voice came out in the wind. A wind spirit, it had to be. I didn't know how they'd found us or if they were telling the truth, but I had to trust them.
As we stood at the edge of the square, I wondered if Willow would give me more instructions. Was I meant to find her on my own from here? I had no idea where I would even begin. I looked down at Elana to find her little hands pressed down into the ground. Her eyes were closed in what seemed to be concentration.
Magic lived here. It breathed through the ground, up through me, and into the air. It was in the heart of every being here, each person giving it life. The magic gave them life in return. As I pressed my hands down onto the stones, I felt my sadness lift somehow. It still hurt, but the magic seemed to give me hope. That might have been a better word for this force than magic. Hope.
The voice kept leading me, telling me which paths to take. My hope grew with every step, despite my usual distrust of spirits who wouldn't reveal themselves. My walking turned to running, cold, crisp air hitting my face. This place must be on the mountain. I reached a clearing and was able to look out. There it was, my home, sprawled out below. It looked so peaceful from up here. It almost distracted me from my mission to find Elana. Almost.
Someone was yelling Elorna's name, as she was so wrapped up in whatever she was doing that she didn't even seem to notice. I almost reached out to nudge her, but I knew better than to touch a human without their permission. Even if it wouldn't burn her, she'd be hurt. "Elorna's here!" I yelled back into the crowd. I didn't want to leave her side.
Elana!
The call came again, but this time in relief. He'd seen her.
My sister was squatting on the ground, her face still smeared with blood and tears, and a fire spirit loomed over her. It was the worst I'd ever seen her. I had never been happier.
I watched as brother found sister, and my Senecal was congratulated. I wondered if she had been touched since I last saw her. The joy around this little group was palpable, so pure, I almost let it be. Then I saw Senel's eyes, and I stepped out of the shadows for the first time in years. "My love," I said, "you came." And her eyes were bright once more.